Now, our next keynote is the digital transformation and the built environment, from design to occupancy. Please, let's welcome to the stage Design Director at Wework, Rachid Abu-Hassan.
Thank you. So my name is Rachid Abu-Hassan. I'm the design director for WeWork, one of the design directors responsible for Europe and Australia because they're very close to each other. I'm based in London, and I'm also based in Amsterdam. For the past 3 or so years, I've been particularly interested in the design side of things and how digital transformation is coming into the industry and disrupting the industry. And as such, trying to basically look closely at how do we get buildings designed and how we build buildings and how do we make sure that there's actually feedback from the occupants of these buildings to the design process. So a bit about me. I started my career actually in New York about 17, 18 years ago. And what I focused on predominantly is performing arts. So I've come a long way across different sectors of the industry. So this is my baby in Athens, which is the Greek National Opera. I spent about 8 years on this, which is what got me thinking about digital transformation and disrupting the industry and how can we shorten the design process essentially. This was just open early last year. I did this project while I was with Arup, the big engineering firm where I've spent the majority of my career. They're known for being the engineers behind the Sydney Opera House. This is one of our proudest projects, and actually figuring out the structural engineering behind the roof structure. And then as of late, I've moved across to WeWork. And I'm basically now based in London looking after developing the model for WeLive. And primarily, again, looking at it from a design point of view, which is really my background. So not necessarily too much delving into the business side of things as our panelists that just were up here were talking about. So that being said, whenever we talk about digital transformation and the design industry, what is often the case is that it's a big ball of chaos. It's just a mess. Buildings take too long to be built. Design takes forever to come together. And at the end of the day, you have occupants that are not necessarily happy with the result, but there's no feedback. That doesn't come back to designers at the beginning of the project. But when you look closely, what you often find is that the construction industry and the design industry is very traditional in the way it operates. That's on one side. Then in the middle, there's a great amount of research that's taking place in universities and in some companies, including my previous employer, Arup. But what's interesting is you go over to the consumer side, and you see things like what the panelists earlier were talking about, which is the wonders of the Googles and the Amazons and how they are actually coming into these homes and actually changing things. But what interests me most as a designer is, what good is something on your wall in your house that you talk to if the building is crappy, right? So that's basically what gets me really excited about what's going on, because I obviously see an opportunity here to actually do a true disruption of the whole thing and redo the model entirely of the built environment. So why is it that things are the way they are and we haven't been really able to break down this and take full advantage of this digital transformation? Well, first and foremost, the industry is slow by nature. It takes 3 years, 4 years to put up a building. Second of all, there are many big legacies that have been operating a certain way in the industry, from the construction side, from the design side. And last but not least is buildings actually cost a lot of money. So people want to get it right, essentially. So there's a lot less risk-taking when it comes to the built environment. But one of the probably most detrimental thing to taking full advantage of digital transformation in the built environment is how siloed the industry is. You've got a group of designers that design a building. You have a contractor that takes on the project, redesigns half of it, 9 out of 10 times. They don't talk to each other. It takes a very long time. Everybody is driven by their own bottom line. And eventually you have a client who is very much involved at the beginning, but not at the end, because there's a tenant at the end who suffers, or let's say, in the case that it's well done, that actually takes full advantage of the building. And it's usually a process of 4 years, 5 years, and it costs millions and millions of dollars. So what's happening in terms of change of innovation? So looking back at my career at Arab, so just looking at the design side for a second and trying to understand what's going on. So a lot of design innovation happens because of projects. It's very basically project driven. You come across a problem and you try and solve it. There's some that is funded research, but what I found to be most useful and sticking is when the two actually come together. And we at Arab did that very good, I think very well, because particularly we were trying to focus on human-centric design. So on one hand, you want to standardize, and on the other hand, you want to make sure that the tenant, the member, what you're designing, actually you're designing around them, and not you're designing something in a bit of a vacuum and then selling it off and remaining involved. We found that it removes inefficiencies from the system, and we found that it actually enhances integrated design. So as an architect or as an engineer, from the beginning, if we are actually working together to put together a beautiful building, then it's much better than when you have an imbalance of power in order to deliver these. So I'm going to take you back to a very long time in my career. This is basically one of the very first attempts on doing something digital in trying to understand the behavior of noise in a room, essentially. And this is something that was built some 20 years ago in MATLAB code to try and figure out and to try and communicate to an architect that that's what I need to do in this room. And then that moved and started to advance as we started to look at pieces of software like 3D Max. This is the GLA building in London, at least this is the inside of the GLA building in London, which we were involved in at the time, and we wanted to communicate, again, how the area where all of the members sat and the rest of the volume engage, and how comfortable they're going to be in the space if we do things one way versus the other. And moving on, as with the introduction of new technologies such as Rhino, such as Grasshopper, we started to basically be able to design together. We sit down with the architect, we sit down with the mechanical engineer, so on and so forth, and we start to actually manipulate the architecture. And we see it happening live, and we see how is it actually impacting, in this case, the audience in this space. And so it does here, where you take it a step further, and you have a full algorithm that actually just does this in the background. And now you don't even need to know what is the best design for this room for you to get the best results for the back of the room in terms of lighting. And then taking it a step further and now starting to look at comfort in terms of heat, in terms of cooling in a building. But not just that, looking at the cost. So going all the way forward and pulling the tenant and saying, how much is that tenant going to pay for a building, for their electricity or for their heating and cooling in the building? And being able to do that while actually you're drawing the building together with the architect. So we're sat in a room and you say, right, if I make the windows bigger, what happens to the energy bill? If I make them smaller, what happens to the energy bill? So starting to think about these things very basically from the beginning, as you start to develop your building, you're thinking about the tenant inside the building. This is one of the projects that we did in Amsterdam. This is basically very early on. We were working with the developer from the beginning, saying, well, you know, if you put a tower, this is what's going to happen. If you rotate it this way, this is what's going to happen in terms of sunlight and the fall of and heat gains on the building, so on and so forth. And all we're interested in this case is comfort. We're interested in costs of running the building. We're interested in all of these things that are very far away because we're still just thinking about the building. We haven't even designed it yet. So this, and that's another example, which basically is just taking any old shape and just twisting it and turning it around. This is all, by the way, developed in-house within Arab at the time. There's a lot of similar technologies. My pitch is it's not being used in the industry as it should to actually really and truly disrupt what's going on. It's being used in the moment only to affect the design bit. So what we're doing is we're making the design better. But still, construction takes forever. We're still not bringing the tenant into the mix as much as we can. Moving on to the construction side of it, so again, working in these silos, there's a lot going on, obviously. You've heard about robotics, we've heard about 3D printing, mass customization, all of these big buzzwords. So there are companies, this is a 3D printed bridge that was done by a Spanish company. The bridge was designed and printed. Obviously, it took a lot longer because it's a prototype, but nonetheless, this is shortening this whole process and creating some very quick structures that otherwise would have taken a few years to put together. This is some research that's going on in the moment in the University of Eindhoven in the Netherlands. This is, again, printing structures, printing webs, printing steel beams, so on and so forth, all in this idea of making it quicker to put buildings. The robot that you see on the right hand of the screen is some of the work that's being done in Switzerland in order to assemble brickwork. And the reason why I threw the other picture there, this is a wonderful Frank Gehry building in Sydney, in Australia. And the facade of that building is actually bricks. And it took forever to lay those bricks because every brick is in a different location in space. So just imagine if you are actually able to have a full-on, fully-fledged robot that actually can pick a point in space and just put that there. And that's the idea. This is where we're going. So all of a sudden you go from taking a year or so to put this up to taking a few days or a few weeks perhaps to put it on. Obviously the other issue here is also not only time scale, but efficiency. So this is another project that we worked in when I was at Arab. My colleagues at Arab at the time, they were designing a structure which, it's a cable net structure. So what you see on the right hand of the screen are these steel nodes that hold together a structure. And as you start to think about how do you print it, you realize very quickly that it can be a lot smaller and still maintain the same strength. It could be made of much simpler materials, and it could, much less material than it would otherwise by doing additive manufacturing. So again, we talk about efficiency. We're talking about shortening the time frame and being able to give designers the ability to dream up whatever they want. Whether you like that shape or not, that's a different story, but that's the idea. So again, we're still sort of in this silo. So design, we're doing our thing. Construction's doing its thing. What about the whole picture, though? How can we disrupt the whole thing? And this is what I find really interesting about digital transformation. And I'm going to diverge a bit here and say, when I've heard this recently, when the electrification of factories happened, it took many years after that in order for the efficiency of the factories to actually start to improve. And the reason for that is because somebody finally figured out that they have to reshape the way the factory is laid out, because it used to be laid out not in an assembly line format, but in how can you get coal to the different machines across and what was the quickest way. So finally, they changed this whole picture and this whole model, and then it started making sense. In our industry, it's basically the same. I think we have to re-examine our model, essentially. And two examples that I mentioned, one of them is, can buildings be products? Can we actually start off from the beginning by designing a building as a product? And then the other model, which is what we're doing at WeLive, is effectively we want to own the whole thing. We want to take this whole process from design to construction to occupancy to maintenance to managing members, and we actually want to do that, all of it ourselves. And then all of a sudden it opens up this opportunity. Well, how can we rearrange this thing so that we don't have these inefficiencies? So I know somebody mentioned earlier how rooms are shrinking and hotel rooms are starting to get smaller to get people out. This is one of my favorite examples of such projects. This is the Citizen M brand, which is a Dutch brand that is now in a number of locations around the world. These guys have basically stripped down the room to the absolute bare minimum. They've taken a few years to actually develop this module where they've said to themselves, what's the most important thing in a hotel room? And to them, that was the bed, and that was the shower, because those are the two things that are very important. So they've designed those bespoke. They've designed them themselves. They've sourced them themselves. They've done a really good job at it. And then they've started to lay out the room, and then it opened up a whole other opportunity for them. Well, what if we can control this whole thing as a product? So they visited a number of factories, and eventually what happened is this room that you see is actually built in Poland in a factory and is shipped to the site. Not all of the sites yet, but a lot of their sites in the world, they ship these rooms and they stack them. And now all of a sudden they can have a building up in the middle of London. This is in the Tower Bridge in London. You wouldn't know that this actually, about 70% of this building is actually being built in Poland and shipped to site and assembled on site. The whole thing from design to construction to completion was about 18 months. So, that we want to talk about digital transformation in the industry. It's ideas like this that is actually moving the industry and shaping the industry, and these are the disruptors in my view. Then we come back to our model, which is, like I said, we want to take everything. But for us, tenants are members. So everything revolves around members and the experience of members. And basically, so this is probably the most common picture of WeLive when you Google WeLive. So going to, I don't know how many of you know the US market and New York particularly, but laundry is a big thing. And it's usually in the basement. It's usually in some scrummy place that you don't want to go to. So again, as designers and operators, it enabled us to think about that and to say, you know what? Why do you do this? We know the model, we know the business model, we know how it operates. I'm going to put this on the 8th floor of the building. I'm going to turn it into an event space. I'm going to have all sorts of bells and whistles and pool tables and ping pong and beer taps and what have you. And I'm going to make it so that people actually have fun doing the laundry. And it's actually one of the most successful spaces in the building, so that's why I put it up. But then, of course, you complement with other spaces like this, because a lot of our clientele is interested in being able to work. Wi-Fi has to be ubiquitous. None of this crap of logging into the Wi-Fi and figuring out where you are. None of this crap of my card is not working or this or that or the other. It's everywhere. If you live in that building, you can be in this space. You can go back and do your laundry with your laptop in your lap, and there are a couple of couches in the corner. It's all things that we control because we own, because we operate, because we design, and there it goes. Some of the spaces, this is our beta WeLive. This is in New York. Again, you see the arrangement of spaces. So the space that we saw earlier, and then the rooms, we've stripped them down, but not that much down. So there's still a bit in the room for people to do and to enjoy, but the living room is outside. The spaces for you if you want to work alone, if you want to enjoy a book in the library, so on and so forth. And these are spaces that are spread around the building. So you don't actually have to physically go to that location because they're all around, they're on your way in and out of your apartment. And this is obviously something new, we're refining, but this is where we are in the process. So in a nutshell, I think digital transformation in our industry is quite exciting. There's plenty of opportunity, and I would just like to say that rather than focusing on the gadget side of it, rather than focusing on the construction side of it, let's just look at a whole picture and see how we can change the way we work so that we actually can truly build a better environment for the tenants, for the members, and a much more sustainable built environment. So that's me. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. And that's it.